Hello and welcome to another Minor Competitions podcast. Today we're joined by Jamie Hamilton, who is a coach at I'm gonna pronounce it wrong. Ayr United.
Ayr United, yeah.
Okay, close.
Yeah, not bad.
And so this is kind of a sort of a departure from the usual kind of stuff we do, and that Minor Competitions is a book series that mainly focuses on art, politics, and media. And Jamie, you are a football coach. So a lot of people might be going sort of, this is an odd combination, but I think it actually makes a lot of sense. And if you look at some of the projects we've done previously, we did a book about Paulo Soldier's autobiography about being an accidental footballer from the 70s, and did an episode with Gabriel Kuhn and a recent episode on football and avant-garde arts. So I thought that'd be sort of an interesting way to sort of have a chat today, with be thinking about not just football itself, but the sort of overlap of cultural dynamics, and how we think about culture in relation to football, aesthetics, performance, theater, a lot of those things which go into the game itself. And so what I did for this is I went and read back through 5 years of your Medium post, which was actually quite fun.
Okay, yeah, that's yeah. I don't envy you, but yeah, well done.
No, it was interesting because, like, there's this line that Deleuze has about every philosopher has like three ideas.
Mm.
And what I take it to mean is like that even across when you're writing about different things, that you will tend to find certain kinds of consistencies or common themes. And I think in your writing, JB, there is some big consistent themes. It'd be fun to explore a bit, if that's okay with you. And maybe
Yeah,
what see, where should we start? Um, I guess the thing we should start with, and the thing you're best known for, surprise, surprise, is the way that you introduce the framing of the difference between what you call positional play and relationism. So maybe we could start with that, particularly that a lot of our audience isn't already going to have a pre-existing knowledge of what that means and where it comes from. So can you maybe unpack that a little bit? Basic start.
yeah. So just to set the scene a little bit, I suppose, for this whole thing, and we could probably start this chapter of it maybe around 2008, 2009, when a guy called Pep Guardiola, Spanish football coach, who a lot of people might be familiar with, took over Barcelona in his first coaching job, and he was extremely successful with this Barcelona team, culminating in 2011 with a really incredible performance against Manchester United at Wembley to win the European Cup. This was the Barcelona team with players like Lionel Messi, Xavi, Iniesta, Sergio Busquets. And not only was this team extremely successful, what captured the football world's imagination was the way that this team played. It was a level of control and a level of mastery and excellence, accuracy that had really never been seen in world football. And of course, by the time 2011 comes around, the whole world can watch. This is also another thing, right? These images are accessible all around the world, and so this caused a real that kind of a rupture, really, and people thought, well, what the hell's going on here? We've not seen football like this. Of course, a large part of it is the players, and guys like Lionel Messi have gone on, obviously, to become incredible legends of football. Xavi, Iniesta, incredible careers. So having very, very good players is always very significant. But what was also clearly a factor was the coaching of Guardiola and what he was actually doing with this team in terms of how they organized themselves on the pitch. And as the analysis got more detailed and people investigated further into what Guardiola was doing and his method, and Guardiola left Barcelona, he went on to Bayern Munich and is now Manchester City, and continues to be very successful. His coaching philosophy, you might want to call it something like that, is what is known as in coaching world and tactical theory world as positional play. This is it's quite an unassuming term, right? It seems, and it's a very loaded term. In Spanish, juego de posición, the game of position. And to give a very crude outline of what that means is that Guardiola, whenever his team has possession of the ball, he has a very clear idea of the structure that he wants his players to adopt. So this is when they have the ball, when they're attacking. So when the centre back has the ball, the right winger knows where they should be, the left winger knows where they should be, the striker knows where they should be, all the way through the team, and they are covering certain spaces strategically, identified spaces strategically in terms of where they can hurt the opposition. It's almost as if Guardiola is using his, and it sounds derogatory, and it probably is a little bit, but I don't mean it to be entirely, using the players like chess pieces and placing them on the football grid. And then the logic of this system would be that once the players are very well positioned, the ball would move around from player to player. One of Guardiola's famous quotes is that he said, no, it's not the players that move, it's the ball that moves from player to player. So you can imagine this idea of coaching where you implement this very strategically designed structure, and you allow that to do a lot of the work for you, and the player's job is to then move the ball around inside that structure. Now, that's a very crude description. Stephen, you want to jump in?
Well, the thing that reminds me of, have you ever read the work of an anthropologist named James C. Scott?
I'm familiar with the name, but I've not read the work, no.
He has this book called Seeing Like a State, where he calls the state logic of optic, which is about rationalized planning, ordered grids,
Right.
understanding space in a certain way that can be controlled, managed, and dealt with as a sort of rationalized space.
Yeah.
As opposed to what he then calls, that's technique, as opposed to Matisse, which is more sort of like informal, emergent knowledge.
Yeah, well, that's the words you've said there, in terms of rationalized approach to space and using grid-like frameworks. This is Guardiola is actually explicit about that terminology. He has said that his game, or football in general, as he sees it, is about the rational occupation of space. He uses those words. And if you look at the training pitches of Guardiola, these kind of went viral a few years ago because people had never really seen this kind of thing before. There's aerial shots of the training pitches that Guardiola would use, and the pitch is divided into a quite elaborate grid system, and some with rectangles and squares and channels and painted on the training pitch. And the idea being that Guardiola would use this grid to help the players orient themselves, to understand where they should be and where they shouldn't be. We don't want more than 2 or 3 in certain lines, because then we can't have passing angles between the players. So if one guy is in a vertical channel, the other guy who's ahead of him doesn't want to be in the same vertical channel, so they would move into the adjacent one to make sure that there's a separation there. So yeah, it's, again, it gets into a little tetchy territory, because the danger is when you talk about this kind of thing that you oversimplify it. There's a lot of complexity going on in positional play and a huge amount of fluidity actually within the system. And this is the whole thing. Positional play is a governing set of principles which can be used in many different ways. It can be, let's say, more rigid or less rigid, but at its heart, it's about the rational occupation of space. It's about finding positions on the pitch which allow you to move the ball through passing, predominantly by receiving and passing to the next guy who is free. Maintaining a free player is a huge part of positional play, because when you have possession of the ball, if you include your goalkeeper in your team, you have 11 players. The defending team doesn't defend with their goalkeeper. They stay in the goal. So immediately you have an 11v10 numerical advantage when you have possession of the football. So a lot of positional play is designed to maintain and maximize and exploit that numerical advantage all over the pitch, so to generate what they call the free man. You should always have a free man. And the idea of positional play is to find that free man, get that free man in advantageous areas, and then play to the free man. This is also while occupying various other sectors of the pitch, so you can access them quickly from wherever you are, because you have players located in, spread across the pitch. So this mode of coaching, this idea of how to play football, became extremely popular, and it essentially began to become the dominant way of thinking in terms of coaching methodology, in terms of tactical theory. It was almost as if, football had been solved to some degree. It's like we have kind of reached this breakthrough whereby now that all teams who want to attack and play possession football essentially will have to adhere to this mode of positional play if they're going to be successful at it. And everything becomes variation on the theme. We become enframed in this new paradigm of thinking. And that's been the way of things, I would say, for, from 2011 up through to the pandemic. Yeah.
It would seem to me that one of the big themes across your writings, not just in relation to positions of play, but overall writing, is almost like the limits of this kind of approach, or what happens when things become too rationalized, too systematized.
Yeah. So, and this brings us to, I suppose, where I started to make to do some research and do some work into what I noticed could be described as an alternative to this. And this is building on existing work that I discovered from predominantly South American football analysts and theorists. And the catalyst for this was in 2022 when I watched a Brazilian team called Fluminense from Rio de Janeiro, coached by a guy called Fernando Diniz, who you might see as some kind of opposite's probably not the right word, but we could even go with it, to Pep Guardiola, in the sense that, in Diniz's own words, his team is apositional. So what does that mean? Well, it means they don't adhere to these principles of having preconceived notions of what are correct positions on the pitch. They organize themselves in a more spontaneous, intuitive manner around primarily where the ball is and the dynamics of that situation. So characteristics of a Fernando Diniz team in comparison to a Guardiola team would be, while Guardiola likes to spread his players out across relatively large areas of the pitch to command those spaces, with the Diniz team, you will see a lot of players around the ball, and you'll see them interacting and moving and in ways that are relatively unconstrained in an attempt to progress the ball forward. So I thought this was very interesting. And of course, in football, you have to be effective, right? You have to win. It's not just an aesthetic endeavor. It's not just like, oh yeah, that looks nice. It actually has to work. Diniz's team actually were winning for a lot of people a surprising amount of games using this style. And that was I suppose, the window into this idea that there could be an alternative to the dominance of positional play as a governing paradigm of football thinking and practice. And like I say, the foundations for that were already there in the writings of the South Americans and Brazilian guys who had noticed this difference between what they called jogo posicional, like the positional game, and jogo funcional, the functional game, where they traced this lineage back through the great Brazilian teams, 50s, 60s, 70s. And we all kind of grow up knowing that Brazil are great, right, at football. It's like something about, the Brazilians play great football. And it's always just been a bit, to me anyway, and maybe in the West in general, this kind of frivolous idea that Brazil, play with fun and joy, and they just, crazy guys, doing mad skills on the pitch. But what was interesting about the literature that was online, not particularly easy to find, but there was certain writings that argued these Brazilian teams were not just a bunch of crazy individuals having fun together, but there was actually a lot of communication and a lot of collective coherence to the way that these teams played. And this lineage is what I eventually ended up dubbing relationism. So as opposed to the positionism of Guardiola and the dominant European schools of thought, and Guardiola's idea of positional play will go back to guys like Cruyff, for example, who made these ideas famous. And the idea of relationism would be to suggest an alternative whereby we don't use this top-down imposition of rationalized space in order to maintain organization, but we switch focus to a bottom-up emergent configuration where the relationships between the players are what actually determines what will happen, where they will be, the kinds of actions that will take place. So that's hopefully paints a little bit of a clearer picture about what I'm actually talking about here.
It's interesting because if you go to read stuff like the work of someone like Jonathan Wilson's book Inverting the Pyramid, or his book The Names Heard Long Ago, that the history of tactics is also the history of different forms of networks of relations. So you have, for instance, like a bunch of Hungarian guys from the 1950s who then move out, who move out various places over the world and bring ideas with them. That shapes the football they're with. Or you have the one blog post where you talk about an anonymous blogger in Brazil who's writing under the name of a Hungarian midfielder.
And this is the thing, right? So while we can say, oh yeah, like this lineage of tactical thinking is Brazilian, you're right. Like a lot of it came from Europe, came from Hungary, when coaches migrated over to Brazil. And I suppose the larger picture here is you mentioned Jonathan Wilson, and I think there's a tendency, and I think Wilson probably does this, to frame football tactics, the history of football tactics, as some kind of like just this evolutionary trajectory whereby everything is just being constantly refined and finessed, and there's like some of the dialectic relationship going on inside this evolutionary framework. But I think there's sometimes a bit of a tendency for that kind of thinking to miss the idea of different, really genuinely different lineages and the different trajectories that these different genealogies almost of football have throughout history, and how they entangle and the different kind of time scales that they're operating on, rather than thinking football tactics is just this one total system whereby, and within it, everything is going to and fro and back and developing and all the rest of it, like spiraling upwards. The more, let's say, the view that I would prefer is that they're actually fundamentally different lineages and genealogies of football that can have their own histories, and they can have their own time scales, and they are always interacting with each other. And of course, we are moving forward in time, but it's important to note these fundamental differences in the style of play.
I think the problem that Jonathan Wilson had in writing the history, and this is a general social science problem, is it's very easy. It's easier to write the history of, let's say, of the things that are planned, history of the plans of the manager and how they changed. But the problem is, and this I guess is a problem for what you're describing, is it's easier to find those history of planning and sort of top-down approaches because you can find people who are doing them. But the plans that emerge from people just developing them in situation don't leave records, don't leave the traces, and those are harder to actually find.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. And you wonder, actually, the thing is, when you read Jonathan Wilson's book, Inverting the Pyramid, and I think, from what I understand, a huge amount of the evidence for the book or the content of the book is gathered from newspaper reports, right, of games. And again, like, who's writing these reports? Like, what was their expertise in the situation? And yeah, you're exactly right. It's more just like a history of the records of tactical analysis, rather than, say, an investigation into the actual dynamics that were causing a lot of this play on the pitch. Like Jonathan Wilson, for me, it's a fairly Anglophile view of what's happening, and you can see that in the way he would talk about, for example, the 1982 Brazilian team, which for me is one of the greatest football teams of all time. But it's typically viewed through the Western lens, through the Anglophile lens, as being this, and I'm paraphrasing, but I think I'm using some of the words that Wilson actually uses. There's a naivety, right? There's a romance to this style of play. It's not necessarily applicable in modern circumstances. It's a bit outdated, it's a bit of a throwback. And he never really gets into how that team actually functioned, how it worked. The level he gets stuck at is just these players were great, Zico, Socrates, and they just played. They just went on the pitch and did whatever they want, and that was fine up to a point. But now we're in the land of systems play. We're in the era of like modern understandings of how tactical strategies affect games. And this is just no longer the case. But of course, what he's missing is the actual internal communication systems of teams like the 1982 Brazilian team, which might not be, like you say, documented or written down in any football training handbook. But when you start to watch the games in a lot more very closely, you start to see repeated motifs, right? Repeated patterns of how this team is actually have how their system works, because they have a system. Is the idea in someone like Wilson's book is that these teams don't have a system. They're just individuals playing together. There's no coherent collective system. And so the whole idea of relationism is to challenge that and push back against that and say, no, there is a system, but the modality of that system is fundamentally different to the top-down, pre-planned approach that is predominant in European theory and play.
I think it's a really big thing, this tendency to sort of misdiagnose forms of organization that don't appear in the way they're expected.
Exactly.
So for a while, if you look at something like the Wikipedia page of Fernando Diniz, it would refer to him as the Brazilian Guardiola,
right?
Which is just hilarious. Or another way to think about this is for years, the way people would talk about the idea of total football coming from someone like Johan Cruyff was, oh, it's very fluid. It's very, and there was just almost this assumption about fluidity of lack of structure, rather than seeing actually there is particular structure and here's how it works and here's how interchanges work, and there's a different logic. It's not the opposite of structure. It's a different kind of structure.
Yeah.
Or the way I think about it is there's this quote from Deleuze and Guattari in What is Philosophy, where they say chaos is not the lack of organization, but it's emergence and disappearance before it becomes perceptible.
Yeah. No, it's really nice. These ideas of structure and fluidity are very prominent in this discussion. And it's, like you say, I think there's been a huge amount of misdiagnosis and analysis that hasn't quite grasped what the dynamics of what's actually happening. And you gave two examples there. The Diniz and Guardiola comparison is very interesting. Like you say, when Diniz's team were winning the games in Brazil and he was rising to, let's say, a position of prominence, the media were quick to dub him, right, the Brazilian Guardiola. Why? Because his team has the ball, but make lots and lots of passes and move up the pitch. But of course, when you watch, and this was put to Diniz, and he rejected it outright. He was like, no, like how the way that my teams achieve that ball possession and domination of the play is completely different to what Guardiola does. Yes, we use short passes, but the structure or lack of structure or different mode of structure of the team is fundamentally different. And it makes you wonder sometimes about these analysts that can't see that. When you see something so fundamentally different as a Manchester City under Guardiola and a Fluminense under Diniz. The total football example from Cruyff, again, is an interesting one because, yeah, like you say, they are very associated with this concept of fluidity. But of course, you can have different modes of fluidity. You can have fluidity within a total system. And of course, the clue is in the title for Holland, right, of total football. The idea is to have the very coherent identity of the system at all times governing the interactions, however fluid they may be, of that system. And that's completely different, right, from, let's say, the more extreme, radical imperceptibility that some people like Deleuze and Guattari might be talking about when in terms of fluidity or whatever, where there is no overriding identity to the system, right? It's in a process of becoming, and it can take on forms that are radically other. They're difficult to even conceptualize or perceive, right, before they actually manifest. And that's a really fundamental difference for me. And I suppose that's, Deleuze wrote a lot about his criticism of Hegel, right? And this idea of the total system, this kind of seamless totality, within which difference occurs, right? Whereas for Deleuze, that difference is primary, right? And there's always that pushback against anything being put inside some kind of totalizing framework. And I think what we're seeing in football is a bit of a moment where people have realized that the framework that we've all been inside is somewhat totalizing. And like I say, the Dutch lineage was given the name total football. That actually goes back to the links with the total architecture movement. that was happening in the avant-garde of Amsterdam at the time. And again, this idea of the total city, it's to have this overriding identity of what the city is, and then all the variation within that city is in relation to that singular idea. Whereas, of course, that's something that, you know, guys like Deleuze would challenge and want to have dynamics outside of this capture of a singular idea. So yeah, there's these ideas of structure and fluidity. I think are misdiagnosed a lot, also to this day, and it's difficult for people to sometimes, because football is actually a complex game and it's moving a lot. And while we're talking in terms of this rigid structure, when you watch football, like, it's moving all the time. So it's always relative, right? This degree of rigidity or this, you know, or structural imposition. It's always relative because it is a very fluid and complex game by its nature. So, although with some coaches you will actually see players standing in their structure, right? Like it's clear that does actually happen. So yeah, there's a lot going on, I think, and it's very interesting. I think it's in one of the reasons why some of my work on relationism has become, or has resonated with some people, is that there is a feeling that this adherence to the singular identity of some kind of totalizing system of theory and practice is in somewhat inhibiting the progress or the potentials that are there for 11 guys to make football on a pitch. Because, yeah, we can get into this. I think the possibilities for action are a lot larger than perhaps we think they are.
Well, I think what you're doing then is a lot of it is providing a language or metaphor, or system of metaphors to describe emerging forms of patterns of relations in football. We don't have ways to talk about that quite yet. And in some ways, I think part of the problem of why that happens is almost kind of semi a media problem. Like, one of the things you talked about was sort of for instance, the rise of Guardiola happened at a particular time of expansion of football, right? The rise of Man United as a team happens where the Premier League, you know, rises. But if you look at sort of the way most football is broadcast, which is how most football is consumed, it's very focused on the ball. And that's all kind of a problem. I'm thinking here of Root Hull had this nice book called How to Watch Football. And the first thing he says is, don't watch the ball, watch the game. And the difference there is, if you just watch the ball, you don't see the movement of the players around it. And a lot of the problems with the way football is broadcast is you get very tight angles where you don't see the movement off the ball. You don't see how people are shifting. You just see the focus of the ball.
Yeah. And look, and it's also important to say that for the vast majority of people who watch football recreationally, that's fine, right? And it's fun, and that's no problem, and that's good. But yeah, as soon as you move into a more analytic or coaching oriented mode of watching football, then yes, it changes. And of course, what every coach wants to see when they're making an analysis, a professional coach, they're not going to use the camera angle that you see on TV. They will get hold of what's called the tactical camera, which is higher up on the roof of the stadium and looks down onto, so you can see the entire pitch at all times. So when you're analyzing a team, you want to see the whole team. You want to see how everyone is moving. You want to see the rotations. You want to see fluctuations in structure. And yeah, while it may be not the best way for everyone in terms of entertainment, it's certainly valuable to be able to see the structures of or you know, where the structures are being used in various teams. And yeah, it's like, yeah, a lot of people will miss that. I think a lot of analysts will also miss that. A lot of coaches will also miss that. Although I think that has, in terms of analysis and coaching, it's become a lot more prominent now, this idea that you're, you know, analyzing the whole team and its function. I think recreationally, sure. I mean, a lot of people just aren't interested in that. They want to see people do cool stuff. They want to see take on shots, dribbles, and you know, that's fine too.
I'll give you an example. A few years ago, for the first time, I took my son to watch Liverpool play West Ham. And obviously, I knew that the fullbacks are important for Liverpool, but I didn't realize, like, until I watched it in person, just how much the entire team was shifting based upon where the fullbacks are moving. And it's almost like you get a different understanding of how the game goes once you see that.
I mean, it's a really useful exercise to to do that, right? To remove the focus from solely on the ball, like Hulett says, and appreciate the dynamics of what's happening, because it's a very complex. I think, again, the reason probably why it's so popular is this deep complexity of football, that you have 11 guys, okay, the goalkeeper stays, but 10 outfield guys who are free to move in any way, right, or unconstrained in their movement around the pitch, which is different from a lot of other team invasion sports. Over large periods of time, right? 45, there are stoppages, but the half is 45 minutes long. And it is very interesting. And it's what I find very interesting about football, is to watch how these different parts, right, the players, these different aspects, achieve collective coherence in a very dynamic, unconstrained environment against top opposition, right, who are trying to hurt them and trying to take the ball from them, trying to score against them. And the way in which this organization, right, and, you know, the way in which the form manifests, I think is fundamental to an understanding of possibilities of where this game might go. Because up to this point, there's been this assumption really that the coach needs to organize the players and, you know, uses a plan or a tactical, relatively rigid tactical idea in order to achieve that. I don't think that stuff's ever going to go away entirely, nor should it necessarily. But I think there's been an overreach, let's say, of that way of thinking. And I would say that there is a large potential now for what we would call bottom-up organization. Of course, it's difficult because we're talking about high-level football, right? You've got Liverpool, West Ham, Premier League. And it's not easy to implement or facilitate some kind of system whereby players could be effective at that level of football whilst using a predominantly bottom-up approach to organization. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
I'm not so sure about that. I mean, if you take someone like Ancelotti, to me it seems that the role he shifted into was almost like his role is to facilitate the players finding the ways to best use their skills together rather than telling them what to do.
That's fair. But the thing about, of course, Ancelotti as well, it's a useful example. He does have the very best players in the world. So, you know, or a collection of extremely talented players who are, you know, are able to do these more instinctive things at a high level. I think the problem, if you know, for the work I've been doing on relationism, for example, you know, a lot of coaches of all different levels are interested in this concept. But if I was just to tell them, well, you know, be a bit more like Carlo Ancelotti and turn up to your under 15 team and just let the players, you know, express themselves and do what they want, that's not, for me, is not sufficient. I mean, the players are, it just doesn't happen because the players are not of a level that is a feasible mode of coaching against, you know, a comparative opposition. So there has to be some kind of coaching actions, coaching behaviors that can help to accelerate the development of bottom-up understandings, right? And I think that's where we are with what relationism is in terms of coaching. It's that mode of coaching that looks to do exactly that. While it's wary of top-down imposition, it's also very clear about the fact that we need to coach the players. We need to give them some kind of common understandings of what's happening in the game so they can cohere together. And, you know, we need to constrain their perception, the way that they're seeing the game, in some way that allows them to have perceptions that are aligned so they can operate as a collective. As you said, you're watching Liverpool, the team is moving in relation to each other. What are they using to guide that collective perception? And that's why in relationism, we would put emphasis on the perception. You mentioned with the Deleuze quote of things appearing and disappearing. You would put emphasis on guiding the player's perception towards what we call emergent structures. So opportunities for action, things like 1-2s, diagonals, certain moments in that arise, that appear, that emerge in the more chaotic aspects of the football game. Can the players collectively perceive those moments, those transient moments that appear and disappear, and actually act on them in that moment that the opportunity is afforded? So it's a different mode of perceiving the game, right? This is the fundamental aspect of it.
I do want to start to ask you about sort of how a relationist coaching might change the way you would approach youth coaching. And it seems to me what
Yeah.
you're saying is that a lot of what you'd be doing is not just telling the players do whatever, but almost like training them more of how you communicate, how you perceive things, how you look for things. I mean, have you ever watched the anime Blue Lock?
No, I've never seen it. No.
Um, Watch it. It's fun.
Mm-hmm.
The story there is there's just like this Japanese plan to develop the world's best striker and creating this academy where and he put all of Japan's best strikers into one team together. And those first few episodes are hilarious because everyone's just like running towards the ball, trying to act as the main striker, and it
Mm-hmm.
goes hilariously bad because it doesn't cohere.
Yeah.
And they have to learn about like, oh no, we can't just all do the same thing. We have to figure out where each other are and how we relate.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, coaching is all about the what's the word? The attunement of a player's perception to certain stimuli or information sources or phenomena that are present or that emerge within the perceptual field of the player, right? Because when you're playing football from the player's perspective, like it's all happening. Like there's a lot going on all around you. There's a lot of different players moving around. The ball is spinning. There's all different dynamics and momentums and motions happening all around you. And of course, you can't pay attention to everything, like in life nor in football, right? Your perception is focused on, well, it will be focused on whether you know it or not on the things that you deem to be of value, right? Because that's why you would, in that moment or in that context, there's a prioritization of things of what you're paying attention to. So for the coach, the important thing is to try to orient players' perceptions towards the things that you as a coach believe are of value of them to be paying attention to. So if, for example, I'm playing a training game or whatever, and the centre back has the ball at his feet, and the opposition are pressing very high, and he's looking around. He wants to pass short. Right? You can see him looking for options, but everyone's marked. They're pressing. Oh God, there's not much here. But maybe he doesn't just look long. Look to the. If they're pressing high, maybe there's space behind the back line, and maybe one of our guys can just run behind them, and he can play one over the top. But he has to look there, right? If he doesn't look long, he won't see the option for it. So and that's a very simple example. But when I'm coaching, for example, I wouldn't shout where to play the pass, but if I think the player is not looking to the last line, I would shout, look to the last line, look long, look long. Not telling them to play a pass or not play a pass, but I want them to be aware of the possibilities of the different actions that they might be able to make. And this, of course, has to be then cohered across these different, everyone's perceiving the game in a different way, right? Based on, and then we get into this, the infinite issue of, the human, because every human is perceiving the game in relation to their own forms of life, right? The nature-nurture dynamic that's going on in their own existence. Like everyone's different. So how do we understand what players are seeing, how they're interpreting the game? And then as a coach, how can we try to bring them together in moments of a football match to see opportunities for forward passes, for combinations? If there's a tendency at the moment, let's say, what I find a lot when I'm working with young players is that they actually don't perceive a lot of the options that are very close to them. So the ball might go into a player and he could have another guy running right next to him who he could just take a little flick to, let's say, and the move could continue. But rather than that, they want to play out to the wing, away from the pressure, away from the opposition, something like that. And of course, that's a question of perception, is that when the ball was being in motion, about to arrive at the player's feet, they hadn't had the perceptual, let's say, elegance to see the various options that were happening and emerging close to them. They'd already had this picture in their head that they were going to fire the ball out to the space, let's say, on the wing. This kind of pre-set idea that can come from various different places. But it's quite easy to see when you're coaching to see players who have these perceptual dispositions. And it's then, for me, that's the job of the coach to go in those moments and try to reframe perception of the player to see different or more opportunities for action. And of course, the key thing being when you're coaching a team sport is that these opportunities have to be commonly understood. So it's not just some random event that happens once in a match, but no, if there are repeated motifs, I mentioned things like 1-2s, diagonal lines. They happen quite frequently in games. Can you attune players' attentions to executing these actions along these, using these structures that are emergent rather than before the game? Here's how you're going to play. Here's the positions. Here's how the passes are generally going to work. Keep to this, and we're going to be okay. So it's a different mode.
One of the things we were talking about before we started recording is the ways in which our emotions shape our perceptions of a game as it's happening. Mm-hmm. And I think that actually what you're saying about not perceiving certain, let's say, non-remarkable passes or opportunities is shaped then. Because think about the ways that, for instance, we remember the amazing across the box cross that leads to the great screamer goal, or the nice long distance shot, but we don't think about all of the sort of non-remarkable passes that actually just keep things going.
Yeah, there's always I remember, in the UK we have Match of the Day, right, which is the highlight show on a Saturday night that rounds up the Premier League action. And maybe not so much now, but certainly back in the 90s, parts of the 2000s, you'd see a lot of headed goals, right, on Match of the Day. You'd see guy, the cross was whipped in and the big number 9 would put the header in, and people would be like, yeah, wow, that's great. So you'd see a lot of these goals. But of course, there's the highlights. They show you the goal, right? They don't show you the 50 crosses that didn't work, right? But because, again, your perception is being framed to believe that these actions are optimal or advantageous. So yeah, when you go into the practice of the game, whether it be coaching or playing it, like, yeah, get the ball, whip the ball in high for the big guy, because that's how it works. It's like, well, no, like that, your perception has been framed actually by media in this sense, by the constraints of media, to believe that certain actions are more effective actually than they are. And again, these are all just, these are perceptual attunements. So as a coach, it's very important that you yourself as a coach have a clear idea of what is of value for the players to pay attention to in each moment. And that could be something like, it could be many things. In football, we typically think about the information sources in terms of being the ball, the teammate, the opponent. People might include space in there, though that is a little bit touchy. And yeah, these are the things. But of course, within those categories, there are infinite variation. If you're receiving a ball, where is the pressure coming from? Very important thing to understand when you're playing football. Where is the pressure coming from? Is it coming from my left, from my right, from behind? And then how do I then interpret what that pressure means? So, for example, a player who's maybe not incredibly good at 1v1 or confident in skills might see pressure and just think, okay, that's fine. I'm just going to lay the ball off. I'm not really going to engage with that pressure. I know I'm being pressurized, so I'm just going to play one touch away from that pressure. And there's players that do that really effectively. They'll move again for the next pass and they'll sort of stay away from the pressure. For another, let's say more individual 1v1, really tricky, skillful guy, they might see that pressure as an invitation to them to manipulate that pressure, right? Oh, he's coming, his momentum, the defender's momentum and, speed is such that if I just make a certain counter movement, he's going to fall on his ass, right? And I can beat him. So that same stimuli, the defender applying pressure, can be interpreted in different ways, right? So it's important, again, for the coach to understand this. You're not trying to force all players to do the same thing. What you want them to be is aware of what's happening around them, and then be able to think, or think's probably the wrong word, is to link this perception and the action to make some kind of effective football behavior, but it's in relation, right, to the dynamics that are happening around them.
Yeah, so here I'm thinking of the article you have where we talked about De Zerbi in relation to Brecht, and how for De Zerbi, you invite the pressure and then engage with it by playing around it rather than trying to avoid it.
Yeah, I mean, he wants pressure, De Zerbi. Like he doesn't want to avoid. He needs pressure for his game to work. The pressure release system that he's designed almost is that he will bait the opponent in towards him, or his players, and then on certain trigger moments, usually the press of the opponent, the dynamics of De Zerbi's system kick in, right? In that moment, little movements happen and they make very fast incisions up the pitch. Like positional play does, like De Zerbi's a highly positional coach, and positional play is doing this too. Like, of course, like you're paying attention to the dynamics of the opponent and those things. But it's what those things mean is the difference, right? And De Zerbi's, for example, De Zerbi's an interesting one to talk about. He has a very clear system of two centre back, usually two centre backs, full backs, two midfielders inside, two attacking midfielders, sort of wider strikers. But he will have this setup. It looks almost like an hourglass the way they set it up, and he will implement. The players have to assume that positional structure, and then within that positional structure, they're allowed to make any kind of almost circuits they want. The balls can move around in different ways. They can do little flicks, layoffs, tricks, but it's always within the confines of that system. So the players get incredibly good and fast at understanding where their teammates are at any moment, what kind of passes they can play, because it's the same all the time, right? The players are always in the system all the time, so they can do these incredibly fast combinations. And it's usually, as I say, activated by waiting for pressure from the opponent, which is fine. But all of the actions are, again, inside this enframing of a positional system. The difference with relationism is, while we're still talking about player perception and taking into account the movements of the opposition, we don't have this structure that we are inside. So the pass that you're going to make will be different every time, right? And this is why the ability to perceive the dynamics of teammates around the ball is extremely important in relationism, because they're not, let's say, where they're going to be. They're not going to be where they were last time and the 10 times before that. It's different. That's I suppose the challenge of coaching relationist football.
Well, one thing I want to talk to you about is it's also a lot of what you see across light writing is a big influence of I'll say artistic and cultural influences and a lot of music metaphors. And I particularly like use of these references, I think, because use of artistic metaphor in part about creating a framing to how you perceive things. So, for instance, like when you talk about heavy metal football, you're emphasizing certain elements about intensity and speed and not other elements. When you talk about relationship as a kind of free jazz, you're talking about a different mode of what activities or what part you're looking at as opposed to others. So it's almost like it's how you frame what you want to look at.
Yeah, there's always these dynamics happening in art, aren't there? In music and film as well, about things that are pre-planned and things that are emergent, right? Like, you can compare a classical orchestra with a free jazz band, and both are coherent, like both are coherent systems who play together, but the manner in which they achieve that coordination is like fundamentally different, right? I mean, the orchestra are playing off the sheet. Yeah.
I'll give you an example. There's this improv free jazz guy quite like named Eddie Prevost, and he runs these improv workshops. And the way they work is, and you start with two people playing together. The way he describes it as he's searching for sounds, and everyone else is listening. And then after a few minutes, a third person next to them joins in, and then they play for a few minutes, and the first person drops out.
Yeah,
and then you have these chains going round and round. So for most of the workshop, you aren't playing; you're listening. And the entire practice is you're supposed to gain almost more by listening, engaging with what the other person is doing, rather than trying to plan something that you already had known in advance.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You're listening for the habits and tendencies of that other player, and this can be applicable absolutely to football as well. And I suppose you're listening for some kind of common motif, some kind of motif that you can catch onto, right? If you want to start playing along, right? Okay, I understand or whether it's something to do with the rhythm or the melodic structure. There's something there that, or the scale that's being used, the key, whatever it is, the rhythm, the tempo. Like whatever it is, I've noticed, or perceived, I can then start to riff, right? I can start to like join in. I can start to do my own, hopefully complementary take on it. And yeah, this is again like these motifs that you might be common in music. I believe they're a good analogy for what I've been talking about in terms of these emergent structures that happen in football. Like there are these, whatever you want to call them, patterns, motifs, these fleeting moments of emergent coherence, let's say. And yeah, a lot of the skill is in, if it's in the music, it's listening to and noticing and picking up on these things. And again, this is why I've been talking a lot about the perception of the players in football, is can they perceive them? Are you listening close enough to what's happening in this game? Are you paying attention to the right things? And it's that ability to pay attention to the, to the appropriate aspect that allows you to join in, right? Because if you don't perceive that opportunity, that invitation for you to come in and join, then you don't, right? You're going to place it's completely incoherent, right? It's crap. So yes, like for me, it's a nice way of trying to. I think it's a useful analogy is to look at football in terms and feel football and coach football in let's say a more artistic or even aesthetic mode. Like, and for me, the question of aesthetic is always there, right? And again, for me, the aesthetic is that arrangement or coming together of phenomena in the perceptual field, right? This is aesthetics. And that for me is always at the bottom of football because it's being played by these players in these complex environment rather than having this idea that the play is predominantly influenced by an abstract created model or schema that has existed outside of this embodied experiential mode. And for me, I'd like to see a reframing of what even the word tactics means, because when you say the word tactics, people immediately think of tactics boards, of computer game visualizations on a screen, like some kind of chess dynamic, right? Spatial control, game of territory, and this kind of thing. For me, tactics is the perception of the player, right? That's football tactics, because those decisions that the players are making are always based on what they are perceiving in an environment and what those things mean to them. For me, that's football tactics, because that's strategic decision making at the bottom, for me, the base level. And if you can align to a certain degree that those, let's say, the way that those players are perceiving the game, then you will have good tactics, because the team will organize in this more bottom-up manner.
What it also reminds you of is there's another coach whose work I quite find interesting. Is have you come across Chris O'Hare?
Yeah.
From
Villarreal. Yeah.
A lot of what he's working on is he's talking about the idea of what he calls cognitive loading or cognitive periodization, basically saying that there's not enough attention to the cognitive skills that the players develop and how that informs the game. And I think that resonates a lot with what you're saying here, in the sense that if you aren't developing those skills, the ability to perceive what's happening and relate to it and work from that is not going to be as developed.
Yeah. So say that again. So if you're
not focusing on sort of the cognitive skills of perceiving what's happening,
yeah,
you aren't going to be able to interact with it the same way, because you aren't seeing it.
Yeah. I guess the word cognitive is always like used differently by different people, I suppose. And you might get even, people might use the term cognitive to say that it's good to give the player the information of the plan, and it's, and then they can store it in their brain, and then they can, put it into action on the pitch. And people would probably use the term cognitive in that sense as well. So I guess it gets a bit muddy sometimes, but definitely, like, as I've been saying, if you want to call it cognitive, or if it's the perceptual capability or perceptual awareness of the player, game understanding, whatever you want to call it. This is, for me, what the role of, I'd say the role of any coach, but certainly from my perspective, when I'm coaching, it is a bit more like a guide if you're okay, it's like, if you're go out into the woods with a master tracker, right? And maybe you're going for a quick lesson on how does the forest tracker work or whatever. Like, they're going to show you how to look, right? What to look for, what to notice, what things mean, because you both have the same, like, you're both looking at stuff, but you, the rookie, right, wouldn't see the things that the tracker sees, even though they're right in front of their eyes, because it's not of relevance until it's actually brought into your field of view and the significance of it is revealed. And for me, that's like football is an environment. So the job of the coach is to show the players around, right? And go, oh, look, did you notice this? This is interesting because this means such and such, or that can mean such and such. I didn't see that. Okay, interesting. So always look for that. That's a good one to look for. So that's the way I see it. It's not so much, I'm not telling the players how to kick the ball. I mean, it's that's downstream. The most important thing is to perceive things that are useful to you, because in football, we have to try to win. It's a game, right? Like, the idea is to win, is to score and not concede. So what are the things in our environment, in our field of perception, that are useful to help us achieving that? And the thing, of course, about football, I would say in that example I've just given of the forest tracker, let's say, things have different meanings in different contexts, right? So it's not so simple. It's not like, oh, that always means that and that always means that. But it's, again, over time, it's an attunement to the sensitivity of the environment and the information that it's allowing, that it's pushing forth to you. And as a player, it's interpretation, right? How are you interpreting these information sources, and how do they then give rise to the actions that you're going to make? So, yeah, if cognitive works as a word for that, that's fine. But like, I see it as like some kind of exercise in perceptual sensitivity, let's say.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, and it's almost like how you go about facilitating those development of perceptual skills, or awareness.
Yeah, I think that's it. And when you're coaching sessions, for me, that's important, right? And of course, everyone's got their own context of, of course, age groups, across abilities. It's all different. But yeah, when we're coaching football, I think it's always extremely important and very valuable to be considering what the exercise is doing in terms of developing the perceptual capabilities of the player, and your coaching interventions, right? How are you guiding and attuning the player to things that you believe are of value?
A few years ago, I was briefly starting to do a master's degree in sports psychology. I didn't end up doing it, but finishing it. But one of the things I remember reading and finding really interesting, I'm going to forget the author's name, but it was an article about skills development in youth football players. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they found was most interesting was that the players who developed the best weren't necessarily those who had the most time in games or most time coaching. It was those who spent the most time in a freely chosen play.
Mm-hmm.
So those who basically played football not because they were being coached at it, which is still important, but because they were out with their friends and just basically messing around. And in that messing around, they actually found or developed those skills themselves. Or they found new ways to find combinations, to find patterns that weren't just given to them. And I think that's the kind of the difference is the thing you find yourself is almost always more deeply learned than something that's just told to you.
Yeah, that's right. And there's so many examples of players who develop their game perceptions, their game interpretations in free form environments. And you can imagine that, if you're a little kid playing the street against very older players, let's say, then you'll, be aware that they're probably going to kick you and hit you if you allow them to get too close to you. So then maybe you develop a way of overcoming that in some way, right? Of moving very quickly, of making dummy movements to stay away from them. All these kinds of different affordances, right? These different environmental factors, shaping the perception of the player. And a lot of that, happens in free play. It's great. Like, it doesn't always happen. It's too simplistic probably to say that just put players always in a free environment and they're going to develop all the things they need. But yes, I think as a diet, as part of a curriculum, I think free play is super important. Palmeiras in Brazil, who Real Madrid just signed Endrick from, Estivao is going to Chelsea now. Part of their academy curriculum is a no-coach football zone, right, where they will have this kind of like bumpy dirt pitch, and the players just go out there and play 7v7, 8v8. And, this academy is producing some of the greatest young players around. And that's not all they do. They have, they have their coaching sessions, absolutely. But part of the diet, part of the curriculum is to play in these free environments. And yeah, like I experienced it myself, actually. It's like when I coach for Ayr United, it's a club in the second league of Scotland. So it's a good standard. And the players, when they arrive, and sometimes they're, I don't know, a little bit nervous or whatever, and there's new players come if they come from a local boys club, let's say. A lot of what I try to do is to make them feel comfortable and say, look, you wouldn't be here if you're not good, and you didn't get good because of me. I've just met you, So what you've got good by playing with your friends, I'd imagine, in whatever environment. Of course, some maybe more structured coaching, but not that much. Like mostly playing with your friends. So that made you good. So keep doing that. Play like that. And of course, then you can refine and tune things and develop things. But that spirit, of playing for the enjoyment of it, of solving problems on your own, using the perceptual cues that you've developed yourself to solve problems, right? Yeah, don't just wait for me to give you all new ones. Like, I like the things that you've developed. That's what's made you good. I'm not there when you're 5, 6, 7, 8 telling you what to do. Like, you did that. So keep doing it. And I think that's something that's probably not appreciated enough. And there's a tendency for coaches to want to control everything. This session has to be like this. And then I'm going to tell them what to do here. And they're going to do a shooting drill. And then they're going to pass from here to here. Then I'm going to tell them how to do that. And I'm going to tell them how to pass the ball. It's like, yeah, they got pretty good without you, So like, it's important to remember that.
By the way, I think that almost goes back to what you're talking about in terms of the difference between positionalism and relationism, is rather than the plan being preordained, it builds upon that which came before. Like, the form doesn't come out of nothing, but comes out of the informality that people already developed and then extends it.
Yeah, there's a nice quote from a Colombian analyst who said that players are tactical facts. And I like that line. Because the tactic, the style, the football that your team is playing is an emergent aspect of the interaction of all these different ways of perceiving that these players have. Right? It's this mad mix, and the collective identity of that team is, for me, an emergent aspect of the interactions of the players, in concert with some coaching guidance, let's say, because it's interesting to consider the role of some people. Like, would say, oh yeah, like, again, it's this whole thing, are you letting them just do what they want? If I was saying that, I would actually just retire, because what's the point of a coach then? So the coach clearly has a role, and I think it depends on the environment that you're in, how much you feel it necessary to put in certain principles, certain perceptual cues that you want the players to use. Maybe you want them to use them just at the start till they get the hang of it, and then they can more freewheel as they go on. Like, there's different modes of it. Ancelotti, the extreme end, who doesn't really need to do any of it. He just kind of says, literally, boys, you're really good, go play. But like I say, when you're under 13's grassroots, that's not really an applicable method. So yeah, it's this balance. We do want to allow the players to express those forms of play that they've developed on their own, and those ways of perceiving and interpreting football. But we also know that we need to have a level of collective coherence in the team, and there has to be an alignment of those perceptions around some common aspects. Doesn't even have to be that many, but at least enough that allows you to be competitive, because you don't want to just go out there and freewheel and get, you're trying to win. It's football. Like, this is not just, depending what level you're in, these things are very important. Otherwise, you as a coach and the players won't have jobs for very long, right? So there's real pressures on it.
Cool, cool. Well, I think maybe we'll leave that as a good sort of pausing point, and I'll just want to thank you for coming along. That was super interesting, and it'll be really great to see how things develop from here. Hopefully next time Fluminense will beat Man City. That would be lovely.
Yeah, I think that was always going to be a big ask, wasn't it? But yeah, I think it's for me anyway, it's a very interesting and exciting time in football because we start to have conversations like these. And sometimes the conversation gets a little bit tetchy in football circles because people have their ideals, and that's also okay. But yeah, I think there's a feeling that there can be some kind of progress made. And I hope these discussions are useful in terms of pushing that progress forward.
Cool. Well, thank you for coming along, Jamie.
And yeah, thanks for having me so much. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.